The biggest challenge facing voting rights isn't a particular law, a particular court, or a particular person. The biggest challenge facing voting rights right now is that what seemed to be a universal consensus that every American ought to be able to vote, that voting should be simple, free, and easy, appears to have broken down. Back in 1982, the Voting Rights Act was amended to provide for stronger protections so that plaintiffs who brought lawsuits under the Voting Rights Act no longer had to prove discriminatory intent. They could win just by showing that a law had a discriminatory effect on voters of color. Chief Justice Roberts at that time was a young lawyer in the White House, and he wrote memo after memo urging President Reagan not to sign these amendments to the Voting Rights Act, arguing that they would essentially amount to affirmative action or a quota system in politics. When he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I think a lot of people were concerned that he would continue to have the same agenda that he had had 30 years earlier. And unfortunately, in 2013, he wrote the opinion striking down the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder was an earthquake. For about 50 years, the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act were absolutely the most important protection that there was for voting rights. That requirement made sure that states that had a history of discriminating when it came to voting got federal approval before making any changes to their voting laws, and it was extremely effective. Shelby County did away with those protections, and for the first time since 1964, we had a presidential election in 2016 without those key protections in place.
Why aren't we having voter ID?
I think that Chief Justice Roberts is undoubtedly correct that things have changed since 1965. Of course they have. You'd have to be foolish to argue with that. What I think is the critical mistake in that assessment, though, is that just because things have improved doesn't mean that we don't still have further to go. And what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years in particular has been, I think, proof that we have much further to go. A wave of laws in the run-up to the 2012 and then the 2016 election made it harder for people to vote, and in almost every instance, disproportionately affected voters of color. Texas's voter identification requirement before the 2012 election, a 3-judge court in D.C. says that under the Voting Rights Act, this law is racially discriminatory and can't be enacted under the preclearance provisions. The Shelby County decision happens, the preclearance provisions are gone, and that day, then Attorney General of Texas, Greg Abbott, now the governor, tweets out, Texas voter ID is back. It's back online. A law that had just been found to be discriminatory because we don't have that part of the Voting Rights Act anymore, boom, is in effect. But that's not all. In North Carolina, the voter ID law was also amended. Certain forms of government photo ID were no longer acceptable for voting purposes. Student ID cards, public assistance ID cards, government employee ID cards were all banned for purposes of voting, and every single one of these forms of ID was disproportionately held by African Americans. To top it all off, the legislature also had racial information about who uses absentee voting. That information revealed that whites disproportionately use it in North Carolina, and absentee voting was the only form of voting that was exempted from the ID requirement. So when the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit looked at this and said, this is a law that targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision, their words, not mine, that description is borne out in the data.
It's something we're working on all over the country, because in the states where they do have voter ID laws, you've seen actually elections begin to change towards more conservative candidates.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
Republicans since 1984 in the presidential races have not been able to win in Wisconsin. Why would it be any different?
And now we have photo ID, and I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well. The law is going to kick the Democrats in the butt. If it hurts a bunch of college kids that's too lazy to get up off their bohunkers and go get a photo ID, so be it.
Right.
If it hurts a bunch of lazy blacks that wants the government to give them everything, so be it.
And it just so happens that a lot of those people vote Democrat.
Gee.
The proponents of these laws shift their rationales for it, which is one reason why we're skeptical of the need for these laws. Sometimes they say we need these laws to prevent voter impersonation. And then when we point out, well, this is not a problem that happens very frequently, they say, well, maybe it's not actual cases of voter impersonation, it's just the possibility of voter impersonation and people's concerns about voter impersonation. We should worry about that. Well, Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, one of the more famous judges of his generation and someone who's regarded as a conservative appointed by Ronald Reagan, had, I think, a very cogent retort to this, which was, if people think there are witches, does that mean we should burn people at the stake? Obviously not. One of the cases that we litigated in the run-up to the 2016 election was a challenge to a law in Kansas that requires people to show citizenship documents like a birth certificate, a passport, or naturalization papers before registering to vote. The evidence in that case showed that 18,000 people had been blocked from registering as a result of this law. Kansas said that they needed the law because it was necessary to prevent non-citizens from registering to vote and casting ballots. And in support of that claim, they had evidence that a grand total of 3 non-citizens had cast ballots in Kansas since the year 2000. I want to make clear one thing. We've never said that illegal voting never happens or that illegal registrations never happen. From time to time, people who shouldn't be registered to vote do become registered, whether because of mistakes on their own part or because of elections officials and government officials, or in some cases, actual malfeasance. The question, though, is whether or not the restrictions that are enacted to combat that problem are worth it, given the number of people who lose their voting rights. And in Kansas, the cost-benefit analysis was abundantly clear. 3 illegal votes against 18,000 people who were going to be disenfranchised in the presidential election, it's not even a close call.
Care about vote fraud, gentlemen? We're fighting it. We could use your help. Thanks. Hey, if you care about vote fraud...
If the statistics aren't going to help people understand that fraud isn't a problem, I do think that taking people through the many steps a fraudster would have to go through just to change one ballot could help. You know, to go and impersonate someone at the polls, you'd have to know where someone is registered to vote. You'd have to know that that person hasn't voted yet. You'd have to hope that no one knows who you are when you're impersonating that person. You'd have to, in many places, match that person's signature, cast that ballot, get out of there, and then hope that that person doesn't show up and become furious when they find out that someone else has cast a ballot in their name. Or pretend to be someone new entirely in a state that has election day registration and have documents which establish that the person is in fact a resident of that place and can vote in that place. So you'd have to have forged documents. Then you'd have to hope that you're not caught, with the knowledge that being caught is, at least with respect to federal criminal law, something that's punishable by several years in prison and I think a fine of $5,000. It's not an efficient way for someone intent on stealing an election to actually do it. Voting has been and continues to be in many places racially polarized. Voters of color and white voters tend to have different political preferences. That racial polarization in voting creates the conditions in which there is a temptation for the majority to restrict voting rights of the minority because it helps them stay in power.